Hi, and welcome to another video presentation for English 2170 Introduction to Film. This is on the life cycle of a genre. We've already talked a bit about genre in class, how genre is the term used to describe different types of film, and they serve important functions. So for example, they help serve as a kind of consumer guide for people who are going to see movies. If you see this poster for Halloween, for example, outside of a multiplex, then the audience member who is thinking about what movie they want to see that evening is going to know it's a horror film and choose to buy or not buy a ticket based on the fact that it's a horror film. So we're all familiar with genre so that we get to see films that we find pleasurable. In addition to letting the audience know what kind of film they're going to see, genres also help producers and directors and studios figure out the demand for a particular genre. So Halloween spawned how many sequels? Good God, probably like 10. And that's because the original film was so popular and because it really was kind of the flashpoint for a new subgenre that we talked about in our last video presentation called the slasher film. This was the era of the slasher film, and Hollywood exploited it to the hilt. And so we had all these sequels allowing producers to realize that whatever was made under the Halloween label for about a decade would do well at the box office. I just wanted to point out that in the original Halloween poster, for example, which I've probably seen 100 times, I saw the film when it originally opened in theaters. I never noticed that Michael Myers' hand, which is holding the killing knife, has a weird kind of face painted on it. So there's that feeling of the uncanny that we talked about in the last video presentation, huh? According to the great film critic John Call Welty, genres goes through 4 stages in life cycle from being brought into cinema to finally sort of tapping out with their audience. The first step in the life cycle of a genre is invention. That is, at a certain point, either a new genre has to be created or a genre that previously exists in literature is migrated into the cinema and becomes popular with audiences. So, for example, if we look at the idea of the monster, which is so key to the horror genre, we can see that the earliest example of importing, say, for example, Mary Shelley's aesthetic in Frankenstein or Bram Stoker's aesthetic in Dracula, was in the Edison Studios Frankenstein that you watched for this week from 1910. There may be other examples, but unfortunately they don't survive, and we don't have any written record of them either, so they may have vanished off the earth. But at a certain point, somebody must have thought, hey, this kind of creepy literature would be fun to adapt in cinema, and they do so, and it proves to be popular with audiences. Once this popularity is established, you will have other producers, other directors, other studios diving into the genre to exploit this popularity, to sell tickets to audience members. And you have what Call Welty calls the second stage of the life cycle of a genre, which is classicism. That is, a number of people start to dabble in the genre, a number of people start to add traits to the genre, a number of people start to reconceptualize the central tenets of the genre, etc. So the version of Frankenstein that exists in the Edison film that you watched for today doesn't last too long and is soon replaced by the kind of canonical Frankenstein, the classic Frankenstein that we associate with James Whale's Universal Frankenstein movie of 1931, pictured here. And during classicism, there's this kind of rush to creativity where people say, what if we bring in a mad scientist? What if we make a vampire film? And the horror film starts to establish all these different traits that will go a long way towards defining what the public believes to be present in horror films. That is, the definition of horror films is created during this period as people start to add more and more to the genre. A good example of this is 1935's Bride of Frankenstein, where James Whale adds a female bride and a kind of campy, one might say queer sensibility. Whale himself was gay, and there's a kind of interesting sort of queer subcharge throughout the entire film. And of course, in the Universal films that are considered to be, the central texts of Frankenstein, you have all these characters being added: Igor, Dr. Frankenstein, the Frankenstein monster, all kinds of different mad scientists and all kinds of different antagonists for the monster. The monster and the popularity of the monster is so acute that it spawns a number of different sequels in the 1930s and 1940s that builds up this classic notion of what we think of when we think of the Frankenstein monster. Once you have this sort of classicist, huge buildup of traits that help to define a genre, that's followed by revisionism. And revisionism is the era where less is added to the genre as they start to tinker with the elements that are already extant. This usually takes the form of a genre splice, where audiences are tired of the classical form of, let's say, the Frankenstein monster, and they want to see a different version of the Frankenstein monster, and you splice it with different genres. A good example of this is Lady Frankenstein, from Italian film made in 1971, which splices together, strangely enough, the Frankenstein monster and the horror aesthetics associated with the Frankenstein monster with a kind of soft porn aesthetic, right? You can see that in the poster there. Only the monster she made could satisfy your strange desires. And you have, horror films that combine westerns with horror. You have horror films that get combined with science fiction, like we'll talk about this week with Alien, a number of different films. So if the classicism second rule of the life cycle of a genre is associated with bringing new invention into the genre, that slows down during the revisionist period, and people start to play with the relationships between the elements that have already been established in the classic form of the genre. And that often means bringing in elements from outside of the genre that you wouldn't expect to kind of splice together and create a new and novel experience. And then finally, there's usually the fourth step of the life cycle of a genre, which is parody. The audience is tired of seeing this subgenre or genre. The audience is used to the Frankenstein monster. The audience is not falling for the novelty of a genre splice in the revisionist phase anymore. And all that's left is to parody the genre. The genre is tapped out. It's lost audience appeal because the audience is just too familiar with the genre. The best way to define, perhaps, the idea of parody as being the life cycle of a genre is to say two words: Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks' entire career is built on taking a genre that's kind of tapped out and playing with it. Young Frankenstein is a good example. So is Blazing Saddles, at a time when the Western and everyone was tired of the Western, and the Western has never really recovered since. Then you have the sort of parody of the first three Star Wars films and Spaceballs, or you have the magnificent parody of the musical, which we'll talk about next week, in The Producers, where the utopianism of the musical is turned on its head. So the four life stages of the life cycle of a genre is, invention, where the genre either has to be created for the cinema or imported from other cultural forces. Let's say, for example, writing, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And then classicism, where people start to tinker with the genre and add new elements to the genre to build it up. This is the type of this is the stage that usually is most pronounced in audiences' heads. This is the stage that usually defines the genre. Then third would be revisionism, where you take the various bits of originality that were poured into the genre during the classic stage, and you start to play with them. And you also start to bring influences from outside the genre that you wouldn't expect in order to continue to make the genre both commercially viable and continue to be novel as well, and continue to be surprising and attractive to audiences. And then finally, that process of genre splicing and spicing up the genre runs its course, and all that's left is parody. And this parody applies not only to horror films like Young Frankenstein, let's say, but all kinds of different movies, right? You Don't Be a Menace to Society While Drinking Your Juice in the Hood takes the kind of idea of gangsta films of the 1990s and turns them on the head. Scary movie, superhero movie. This idea of parody plays off our knowledge of a genre, and we are entertained by watching it go through the genre moves, making fun of the genre. And that really is the last stage of the life cycle of a genre. Usually after that, after the parody wrings out the last amount of money and appeal that the genre might have, we move on and we find other genres to invest in. Audiences move on, producers move on, and the genre is left fallow for a while until somebody comes back and reinvents it and starts the life cycle all over again. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk about these issues in class.